My name's Niall Ferguson. I'm the Milbank Family's Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It would be amazing if we weren't experiencing a crisis of confidence in global capitalism, given that in 2008-9 we had the biggest financial crisis since the time of the Great Depression, since 1929. And at the time, I remember writing this in early 2009, it was perfectly clear that there would be a backlash. The shock was an enormous one. It affected some countries as severely as the Great Depression, Greece, for example. And if there had not been some kind of reaction, that would have been remarkable. What happened was that there were two different reactions. I'll call it the populism of the left and the populism of the right. The populism of the left said, this is a terrible thing, and the bankers are to blame, therefore bankers must go to jail. And that was a more or less satisfying narrative, but much less effective than the one that the populists of the right made, which was, this is a terrible mess, and it's all the fault of the Chinese, the Mexicans, and a corrupt elite in Washington. That kind of argument was much more politically potent than the left-wing argument. And that's why in the period after the financial crisis, it was the populists of the right who generally did better, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. If you look at the data on income or wealth inequality, that had been widening since the 1980s in the United States, and indeed quite a few other countries around the world. But in a rather imperceptible way, it took the financial crisis to make everybody start talking about inequality. And one of the lessons of history is that the trends, if they unfold over decades, don't necessarily produce big political outcomes. There needs to be some kind of catalyst, and a financial crisis typically provides that. There's good evidence to support this. In fact, there's an excellent paper co-authored by my good friend Moritz Schullerich, showing that in every financial crisis since 1870, in all the major economies for which we have data, right-wing populism does better than left-wing populism. And it's paradoxical, because you would think a crisis of capitalism would be a great opportunity for the left. It actually tends to be a great opportunity for the right. And the left struggles to get political benefits. However, from a left-wing perspective, there's good news. The populists of the right tend to benefit from the crisis, have a run of years in power, and generally fail to deliver enough in terms of results to their supporters. At which point the pendulum begins to swing from right to left. And that's what's happening now. It started to happen quite early on in Britain. The Labour Party shifted to the left, and it's only really been since the Brexit referendum that the probability has gone up of a Labour government coming to power under the most left-wing leader in Labour's history, Jeremy Corbyn. You see it now in the United States. 2.5 years into the Trump presidency, the political action suddenly shifted to the left with the advent of political newbies like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, new left of center, radically left of center members of Congress. So one of the features of our age is that the pendulum swings further to the right, then further to the left than it did in the pre-crisis period. A common mistake in much of the commentary we've seen in the last few years has been to go on about the 1930s and to say, oh gosh, these populists are really fascists and we should be very worried because Donald Trump is the American Mussolini, for example. And I think those analogies are really unhelpful for two reasons. First of all, we didn't have the Great Depression. The financial crisis produced a big shock comparable with that of 1929-30, but it didn't produce 10 years of unemployment at 30%. It didn't produce the extraordinarily protracted and severe depression of the 1930s. In fact, we recovered remarkably quickly thanks to a mixture of monetary and fiscal stimulus, so that it's not really surprising that we haven't got such violent extremism as there was in the 1930s. Second problem is that populism and fascism are different things. Fascism is about wearing paramilitary uniforms and marching around and talking about invading countries. It's a distinctly violent and militant form of politics. Populism isn't like that at all. It's overweight guys in suits talking about trade wars, not actual wars. In fact, populists are quite reluctant to invade countries. They tend to be hostile to aggressive foreign policy. So populism is quite different from fascism, and it's a category error to use these terms interchangeably. To understand where we are now, you need to go back to the late 19th century. The late 19th century saw a period of extraordinary globalization. I tend to think of it as the first age of globalization. Enormous increases in trade, in capital flows, in migration. And then in 1873, there was a financial crisis, one of the first really global financial crises. And in the aftermath of that, populism on both sides of the Atlantic came to the fore, and it was the usual cocktail. Nativism on immigration, we have to restrict immigration. Backlash against free trade, we have to impose tariffs. Attacks on corrupt elites, these terrible people who run the place have to go, and the outsiders come to the fore politically. This is the standard formula for populism. In most cases, there's some elements of racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. They all were there in the mix in the late 19th century, just as they are today. But I don't think that they're the dominant traits. Populism is fundamentally about economic policies changing. It is about tariffs. It is about restricting migration. In the 1870s, there was a chap named Dennis Kearney, who was the Donald Trump of California, whose slogan was, "The Chinese must go." And he campaigned to restrict immigration from China into the United States very successfully, so that in 1882, Congress passed the Exclusion Act. And from that point on, Chinese immigration to the United States was limited to the point of stopping altogether. So we've seen a late 19th century version of this movie before, and there's nothing about it that's new. In fact, Trump in some ways is a populist very much in that 19th century American tradition. So you don't need these analogies with 1930s Europe. They're actually completely misleading. What tends to happen in the wake of a crisis, as the dust settles, is that they castigate big business. And it's very striking that the big banks were the first targets for public dissatisfaction, but that has spread in recent years to the big technology companies. And I think there's a good reason for that. Ultimately, what has made our populism distinctive is not so much the content, not the ideas, which are entirely historically familiar. It's the form. And the form has been determined by the advent of social media, the dominance of our public sphere by network platforms, Google and Facebook in particular, but also Twitter. And it perhaps was predictable that after a certain amount of time, these network platforms would be the targets for attack. Facebook became the villain of the 2016 political crisis in the same way that Goldman Sachs was a villain of the 2008-9 financial crisis. So I think this is in many ways logical. The public rightly realized that Facebook had accumulated far too much power, particularly in the political realm, and had not used that power at all prudently. We now have a debate, which is one of the few bipartisan debates in the United States, about the power of big technology companies. Antitrust is an issue that you hear debated both on the left amongst Democrats and on the right amongst Republicans. Regulation of these big tech companies is no longer a taboo subject. Republicans used to be allergic to the word regulation. Now that they see big tech companies engaged in what they suspect is censorship of conservative views, they've discovered the joy of regulation. And there's going to be a very animated debate over the coming years about how exactly we rein in the power of these companies. From the vantage point of view of a chief executive, reputation is extraordinarily important. If your company has not been in the crosshairs, or let me be more precise, has not been on the receiving end of a Twitter storm or some other form of social media crowd shaming, then don't worry. It soon will be. It is, I think, part of the new post-crisis world that every reputation of any entity or individual that is publicly prominent will come under attack. You don't need to put many feet wrong. One gaffe will do it. One slip, one lapse can get traction on social media in an enormously rapid way, and it can escalate in a terrifying way. Carnegie was extraordinarily revolutionary in his philanthropy. He said that you should give it all away, not half, as in the giving pledge that we have today, all of it. In a wonderful essay on wealth, Carnegie argued that you should spend the first third of your life educating yourself, the second third making money, and the third third giving it all away. So there's a reason that we remember him fondly. Most of us associate him more with public libraries than with steel. I think there's a lesson here. We see some people learning it well. Bill Gates. We've pretty much forgotten Bill Gates, the software monopolist, and now he's Bill Gates saving the planet every day of the week. I think each of the big names in any top 10 list of billionaires is approaching this challenge in roughly the same way. It's just a question of what form the philanthropy takes. George Soros is interesting because Soros might have become the villain of the left, but because despite making his money as a speculator, he admits that's what he's done, he's devoted his philanthropy to broadly progressive left-of-center causes. He's avoided that. Instead, he's become a hate figure for elements on the right. Maybe the lesson is that if you've become a billionaire, somebody's going to hate on you, and you just have to decide who you want it to be. We have a major problem in education, and indeed in higher education. There's a chronic problem of quality in the public school system in the United States and in many other countries. There's also an increasing distortion and skew in universities, which have become extraordinarily unrepresentative ideologically. They have every kind of diversity except viewpoint diversity. Now, you would think that chief executives would have an interest in meaningfully improving education, because after all, without good education, the quality of the workforce is hardly likely to be up to much. But we do nothing meaningful. There is very little that is happening that would correct the diversity skew at the universities. I see very little happening to improve the quality of teaching in public schools. Very few entrepreneurs and executives seem willing to take what might be an unpopular stance, backing charter schools, for example, incurring the wrath of the teachers' unions. Very few are willing to say to the universities where they studied, I'll give you money, but only if we see some meaningful viewpoint diversity. So what I actually see is not corporate social responsibility. I see corporate social irresponsibility, virtue signaling, rather than the kind of tough and brave interventions in public life that might make a difference. The quality of recruits, even from elite institutions, and yet nobody seems to do anything. What is it that you really need people to know before they show up? Why isn't it being taught at Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Stanford? And if it's not being taught, why don't you endow a chair that would actually teach somebody about the history of socialism, just for example? So there's plenty that can be done. I think it requires a greater amount of backbone than we currently see. I think there needs to be an appetite for risk, not only with respect to the P&L of a firm, but also with respect to its public image. What I see in the realm of corporate social responsibility is massive risk aversion, terror of being called out or shamed for some act of political incorrectness. I see an extraordinary difference in the way companies behave with respect to business and the way that they behave with respect to everything else. Capitalism is in crisis. as usual, situation normal. There always will be some kind of a crisis. There will always be people questioning the legitimacy of the system. As Joseph Schumpeter said in Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, published in 1942, capitalism has at its heart creative destruction, and that creates pain and that creates losers. Capitalism tends to create a class of people who are professionally critical of it, called academics. And capitalism is susceptible to the political exploitation that makes bureaucracies and legislators always interfere in the market process. So this is the kind of normal state of affairs, and we shouldn't be surprised that that's going on. In a worst case scenario, the pendulum on both sides of the Atlantic, indeed in all democracies, swings to the left, and we decide to rerun the whole futile 20th century experiment with socialism, with large increases in taxation, ambitious schemes of redistribution, large-scale interventions in the economy in the name of the environment, such as the Green New Deal, with all the predictable negative effects that will have on growth, all the perverse outcomes, the increase in corruption that always comes with increased state intervention. So in my worst-case scenario, we do all that, and Generation Z and the millennials learn the hard way what the baby boomers learnt already back in the post-war period, that socialism doesn't work. And your intentions may be good, but the outcomes will almost always be bad. In a base case, we don't go quite that far. In a base case, we encounter a slowdown, a recession in the US at some point in the next few years, but we manage as we've managed in the past. The institutions of democracy stand up in most countries. The US Constitution proves that it's the best designed constitution ever because it copes with the era of Donald Trump with all his eccentricities and idiosyncrasies, and we get along. In a best case scenario, and I'll end on an optimistic note, the US gets its act together, realizing that it is in a competition with a one-party state that is reinventing totalitarianism with facial recognition, AI, and total surveillance. And the US wins the race for supremacy in artificial intelligence and its military applications, wins the space race, because that's back, wins the quantum computing race. The US reforms its immigration system. It cleans up its messed up public finances. It reboots its democracy by tackling some of the abuses that have so eroded public trust in Congress and other political institutions. And we look back and say, isn't it amazing? The United States goes through these periods of crisis, the 1930s, the 1970s, and now, and then it reinvents itself and remains number one. That's my optimistic scenario. And I'm sufficiently pessimistic about the Chinese alternative model, which is essentially totalitarianism with AI, to think that that will happen. That in the end, the values of freedom, economic freedom and political freedom, are too well aligned with human nature for a free society to lose to an unfree one. The best case from a Chinese vantage point for China is that as the growth rate slows, which it certainly will for demographic and other reasons, the system remains stable. That is to say, the existing system can cope with 3% growth rather than 6% growth, which is, I think, plausible in the sense that Japan managed a comparable slowdown without its institutions falling apart. Obviously, the worst case scenario from a Chinese point of view is the thing that China's leaders always worry about, which is some kind of descent into dongruan, of turmoil, where the enormous edifice of the party and the state, which have held together this vast society, a fifth of humanity, has one of its historically occasional crises. Centrifugal forces take over. The center in Beijing no longer is able to control the periphery, and China enters a time of troubles comparable with its mid-19th century troubles in the Taiping and its mid-20th century troubles in the Civil War. So I think everybody in China knows that that's the worst case scenario. They have sufficiently fresh memories of chaos in the time of the Cultural Revolution that there is a kind of collective risk aversion. So I would attach a higher probability to China coping with slow growth than to its descending into turmoil.